I'm Richard Hefner, your host on The Open Mind, and probably the most straightforward point that I could make about today's program is that I so fervently wish that I had the wit and the skill and the learning and the insight to write the extraordinary book I want to discuss with its author in just a moment. Neil Postman of New York University is my guest. His newest book, Vikings Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. Well, now, first, though, I want to remind you of American intellectuals' long-standing tradition of demeaning the media, of bemoaning their fate, as one parodied it some time back, the big media and the little me. Presumably, the masser the media, the messier their impact upon the presumed good life of yesteryear, that simpler age of better men, noble savages, indeed, who stood so strong, supposedly, so silent, so serious, and so untouched by the media babble of our own benighted times, that hated serpent in the garden. Well, today, of course, some intellectuals seem to have grown weary of media bashing. I note that even such card-carrying print people as Walter Goodman and Anatole Broyard have reviewed a tad cynically Professor Postman's dire criticisms of television. Goodman assures us that the barbarians, though always with us, have not quite triumphed, dismissing our guests' apocalyptic prophecies of culture death. And Broyard, however, inflicts the unkindest cut of all, writing of Neil Postman, if he were not so elegant in his turn of mind and phrase, we might mistake him for one of those authorities who engage in earnest discussion on television talk shows. And here you are, Professor, on a television talk show, and I wonder how you can rationalize it.
How prophetic he was. Well, there is a paradox, of course, in writing a book like this and then going on television to tell everyone about it. But it's rather easy for me to resolve this paradox in this case because among the programs I mention in this book that tried to bring some intellectual decorum to public discourse is The Open Mind.
Yeah, but you still go on, I appreciate that, there's no question about that. You still go on to say that entertainment is the super ideology of all discourse on television, and you seem to imply that the babble of television precludes the kind of discourse that you think is so important for this country.
Well, I think most of it does. I mean, this program, I think you will acknowledge, is not a typical television program fare. And the fact that it has survived so long, I think, has to be explained somehow. You'll have to explain that to me. Perhaps we could say, well, it's on at Sunday or at a time when it will not compete with the entertainment-oriented programs that I think make up the bulk of television in America.
So it's bulk. It's not all of television then.
No, it isn't. As a matter of fact, and I do mention that there are some cases in broadcasting history. Now, I want to go back to radio for a moment, where programming ran against the grain of the bias of the medium. For example, if I'm not mistaken, Major Beau's Amateur Hour occasionally featured tap dancers, and I think I recall a mime once. Radio obviously is not well suited to tap dancing or mimicry, and I think television is not really well suited to what we're doing now. I mean, we're two people in the act of thinking, I hope, and thinking is not a performing art. And I think what television requires is a performing art.
Why so exclusively? Why does it require a performing art?
Well, because people mostly watch television. And what they watch and like to watch are dynamic, ever-changing, exciting images. The average duration of a shot on a network television show is 3.5 seconds. Now, what your director has is confronted with now is what I think TV directors call talking heads. And if I'm not mistaken, this is anathema to most TV directors, largely because they're under the impression, and I think correctly, that audiences prefer to see fast-moving, quick-edited images.
Then you're talking about audiences. You're not talking about the nature of the medium itself. You're not talking about the people who direct the medium.
Well, I think here that I might have to agree at long last with the TV executives, especially American variety, who say that American television has developed along lines that will accommodate not only the bias of the medium, but the interests of the audience. In other words, audiences seem to want to watch television in the way American television has developed.
Is that why it is so popular overseas as well?
Exactly. Wherever American-style television has competed with government-operated talking head television, American television always wins. Even in places like Israel, where television is largely conceived of as a medium for education and propaganda, what you have is people watching Jordanian television because they can get it and because Jordanian television will give them St. Elsewhere or the A-Team or whatever American programs are available. America exports about 150,000 hours of television worldwide, distributed equally among Asia, Africa, and Europe. So that I think I could say that American television, in one sense, is the best television because it accommodates the biases of a visual medium.
These are American centurions marching overseas, the television programs, the films?
Well, it's one could say it is a form of imperialism. The Chinese, the People's Republic of China, has contracted with CBS for 60 hours of American television. Contracts with NBC and ABC are sure to follow. What the Chinese don't know is that their gang of 4 is as nothing compared to our gang of 3. Now, there's nothing here that is a conspiracy. I think American television is imperializing, so to say, the taste, the expectations of people all over the world. But the first country that was invaded by American television was America itself. And that's really what my book is about.
But why do you say invaded? You make it sound, although in parts of this gracious book on public discourse in the age of show business, and I remember Dick Salant used to say that everybody had 2 businesses, his own and show business. So it's a very attractive book about a very attractive subject. Why is there this notion of imposition? Why is there this notion of imperial control, first here, then overseas?
Well, I don't want to claim that American television executives or networks set out in some sort of organized and systematic way to alter the way people will express themselves in politics, religion, education, and so on. I think rather what has happened is that we have a new technology used in different ways, to be sure, in different parts of the world, but nonetheless a technology that in its American expression tends to suppress, undermine, and otherwise degrade what we call literate, analytic, rational discourse.
Would you be willing to say it changes that discourse?
Well, it changes it, yes. That's where I would begin, but I don't want to end there, because I think, for example, when political campaigns in America are conducted largely by 30-second TV commercials, it must be obvious that candidates can no longer spend the time, or will no longer have the time, even if they had the wit and syntax, to explain in any sort of complex way the issues that the voters have to face. So what do we do about this? I mean, I don't say that this is a conspiracy on anyone's part. If you and I are running for office, I am going to try to beat you through the 30-second television commercial. And you can, if you decline to use the commercial and instead choose to publish intelligently written position papers on all these issues, you will lose.
Professor Postman, you seem to be positing first almost a perceptual shift based upon a change in technology. And then you fight to avoid it. And it is almost as if you were saying, stop the clock. You say you're not a Luddite. You say you don't take a Luddite position. But it sounds to me as though you do.
Well, here's what I think about that. It's a vulnerable point for me, in that sometimes I seem to myself to be saying, stop the clock. I would put it this way. I think it would be possible if, assuming that everyone agreed that the visual and entertainment-oriented TV that has become the center of American culture, assuming everyone agrees that it has degraded public discourse, then I think it might be possible, for example, through social policy of one sort or another, for us to minimize or mitigate some of the worst effects of such a situation. For example, there's no reason why we could not ban political commercials on television. I believe former Mayor John Lindsay suggested that once, and we have precedents for it in that we ban cigarette advertising and liquor advertising from television. Might not be a bad idea for us to consider banning that form of politics.
But if one were to join with you in wanting to turn the hands of the clock back, destroy the machine, how possible is it, if you pick television political commercials, if you pick this or that, when you yourself have suggested in this book, and suggested so well, that it is the machinery itself that has changed the world of communications?
Let me make this distinction that might help, at least it helps me to think this through. I try to make a distinction between a technology and a medium. A technology is to a medium as the brain is to the mind. Like the brain, a technology is a physical apparatus. Like the mind, a medium is a use to which we put physical apparatus. Now, you're quite right in saying that I argue that this technology of television has a bias. It does tend to want to move, if we can anthropomorphize it for the moment, in a certain way. It wants pictures. It doesn't want talking heads. Nonetheless, it would be possible, if we know this, to use the technology of television in a somewhat different way from even television's own biases. Now, in many European countries, this is the case, that television is used, so to say, against its best effects. But things are changing in Europe, too. You were about to say that.
I was indeed about to say that.
And recently in Sweden, there were national elections. For the first time in a long while, the Social Democrats were challenged by the Conservatives And one of the principal planks in the conservative platform was to bring in American-style television to Sweden, with commercials and with everything packaged more or less in the form of entertainment. Now, I worked as a sort of unofficial consultant to the Minister of Media. They have a Minister of Media in Sweden who needed some arguments to hold off this this thrust. One of the good arguments that it was very telling in Sweden is that a city like Stockholm has 1.5 million people. It has about 6 daily newspapers. If commercial television came to Sweden, much of the advertising revenue that presently goes to the newspapers would go to television, and the Swedes might end up with just 2 papers in Stockholm, and both of them might in the end tend to become picture newspapers, as has already happened in New York. Am I right in thinking that 30 years ago New York would have had 11 newspapers?
Something like that. I think perhaps
like
more.
That. We now have 3 daily newspapers, and 2 of them are picture newspapers. Our most successful new national newspaper, USA Today, is not only sold on the streets in receptacles that look like television sets, but is also essentially a picture newspaper.
But you know, as I look through your book, I come upon so many places in which you seem to be saying, this is inevitable. When the process has begun, it's not going to stop. The very dynamics of the medium. Why? You know, let me just puzzle this one out with you. You seem at the end of the book of amusing ourselves to death. There's very little you can do once you're dead. And you posit the notion that we are amusing ourselves to death. At the end, you almost seem to feel, in a couple of pages, that you have to do what it is. I noticed that your critics, the reviewers, criticize you for not doing enough, and that is find a way out. Through the rest of the book, there is no way out. Why do you want to embrace this notion that we're going to live in a different world, but somehow or other we're going to maintain an ideology peculiar to the past?
Well, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays,
when you teach,
I'm apt to be a sort of technological determinist, that in believing that television will play its hand out, so to say, the way the printing press did. And it will give us a new kind of culture altogether, as did the printing press. And that there would be...
And you're very persuasive in documenting that in this book.
But then there's always Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Sunday, one rests, where I think that to the extent that people are aware of how a technology has been used, what sort of medium it has become, I think it's not inconceivable that modifications could be made, and through education alert people to certain problems that a medium has brought about, that would in fact make a difference. For just one example, I do talk about, perhaps too much in the book, about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and then try to contrast them with, let's say, the Mondale-Reagan debates. And I think of Barbara Walters, for example, asking the president for some answer to a complicated question about the Middle East, and then saying, Mr. President, you will have 3 minutes to answer, after which Vice President Mondale will have 1 minute to rebut. Now, one thinks of Abraham Lincoln taking 3 hours to talk about the issues, Stephen Douglas 3 hours, and then Lincoln an hour more to debate Douglas. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if Reagan and Mondale had turned to Barbara Walters and said, what sort of people do you think we are? What do you take us for? We're serious men running for high political office. These questions cannot be answered in 2 or 3 minutes. Or even better, if they said, what sort of people do you think the American electorate is made up of?
Now, what would your answer be to that? Because you have already posed the notion that the electorate, made up of people exposed to television as an entertainment constantly, are people who in all likelihood will not sit still for Lincoln or for Douglas or for Reagan or for Mondale pretending they are Lincoln and Douglas.
But it's my belief that one of the reasons people accept the religious entertainment format for religion and politics and education is that there has not yet been a full and adequate dialogue among Americans about the impact of new media, even the computer, which is not the subject of this book. But I've noticed that now, once again, Americans are going into their usual stance in the face of a new technology, which is a great deal of enthusiasm, but no serious discussion about what its effects will be. It's my hope that if there were some sort of serious dialogue, which could begin in the schools, as part of the education of children, then there would be an awareness of how the definitions of debate have changed, the definitions of knowledge have changed. That we would have to begin with education, I'm quite sure.
But you know, in your book, which you don't entitle, "We May Amuse Ourselves to Death," watch out, beware, take steps, you say we are amusing ourselves to death. And you are almost determinist in the way you present it.
But if, you see, if I were that, I don't think I would have written this kind of book. This book, as I say, is a lamentation about this, but it's also a grievance, a complaint. And it's my hope that America, which still has, I think, enormous vitality, and when one goes overseas, one realizes this immediately, that America can contradict in Aldous Huxley's prophecy.
You mean we can have a picture culture, we can communicate via images, doing violence to the Second Commandment, and still avoid what you want us to avoid?
I think we could. You see, if people don't go to the movies to find the ball scores or the latest political news, they go to the movies to see the picture. And they don't buy LP records to get the weather. They buy that to hear the music. At the moment, television has become the command center of the culture. People go to television for everything. And there's the rub. But I am encouraged because people like not only Robert McNeil, but also Ted Koppel have said the same thing, that television, with its preoccupation with entertainment, with fast editing, fast dynamic imagery, is changing the nature of serious discourse in America. And if people like this, not only academics, but people in the industry, are beginning to worry about the kind of dialogue and discourse Americans can have, then I don't think one has to rest with a determinist position.
Now, the next book, written on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, will it counter what Postman says here?
Yeah, it could. It could. I mean, a lot would depend on the extent to which voices come from people who control the technology themselves. Not only Richard Hefner having me on the program, but someone like Ted Koppel, as I mentioned, McNeil, but there are others who are serious people and who understand that not everything that is important is televisable. And when you accept the entertainment orientation of television, you're doing something very damaging to America. And I think there are people who understand this, and with their help, I think maybe we could pull out of this.
You don't feel, then, that, in fact, our perceptual apparatus has been changed?
Well, I think our habits have been changed. I don't know if, I doubt that we've been changed neurologically, but perceptual apparatus is a good way to put it. I think we're seeing the world in fragments now, and as a kind of Las Vegas stage show. But I don't think that it's necessarily terminal.
When you talk about terminal, we have just a minute or so left. I was interested in the respect you pay to McLuhan. And yet there is that notion in McLuhan that a sea change has come about. Never mind the content of the medium itself is the message. Are you backing away a little from that notion?
Well, perhaps a little. I think McLuhan is an extraordinarily important person in this dialogue, because I do think he asked the right question. In this case, it is not so much what people watch, but that they watch. But I would backtrack a bit, as you suggest, and say what they watch is also a key factor, because they don't, we could make of this technology a somewhat different medium from its own instincts.
In 30 seconds, what kind of bet are you willing to make, Professor Postman? Shall we or shall we not? Will we perish with the sword of showbiz?
Well, if to the extent that there would be a serious conversation among Americans about these issues, I think we could pull through.
But what's your bet as to whether we shall or shall not?
That we will. That's my bet. But don't forget, I'm an American, which means I'm eternally optimistic.
So you're hedging your bet. Thank you so much for joining me today, Neil Postman. And thanks, too, to you in the audience. I hope you'll join us again next time here on The Open Mind. Meanwhile, as an old friend used to say, good night and good luck. Continuing production of this series has generously been made possible by grants from the Richard Lounsbury Foundation, the M. Weena Foundation of New Jersey, the Mediators and Richard and Gloria Manny, Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence A. Ween, Pfizer Incorporated, the New York Times Company Foundation, and G.D. Searle and Company.